the most brutal and unfair matchups of the Roman Colosseum. Welcome, dear reader, to the twisted theater of the Roman Colosseum, where the sands were soaked with blood, the air rang with roars. Both human and beast and fairness was as rare as a quiet day in Rome. Before we dive into this arena of chaos, take a moment to settle in, maybe grab a drink, and imagine you're perched on a stone bench under the blistering sun, surrounded by a crowd baying for spectacle. If you're enjoying this journey into history's darker corners, let me know where you reading from and what time it is, whether you re-sipping coffee at dawn in New York or burning the midnight oil in Tokyo. It's always thrilling to see who's joining us for this grim ride. Now, dim the lights, let the hum of the modern world fade, and step back to a time when entertainment meant survival, and survival was never guaranteed. The Roman Colosseum, a monumental amphitheater in the heart of Rome, was a stage for some of the most spectacular and horrifying displays of human and animal suffering in history. Built between 70 to 80 AD under the Flavian emperors, it could hold up to 80,000 spectators, all eager to witness bloodshed, bravery, and bizarre spectacles. While gladiatorial combat is often romanticized, the reality was far grimmer, with many matchups designed not for fairness, but for maximum entertainment, often at the expense of the powerless. Let's explore these brutal contests, starting with the least unfair and working our way to the most egregious, delving into the lives of the participants, the cultural significance, and the sheer spectacle of it all. Imagine being thrust into an arena, your vision completely obscured, your ears muffled, and your only weapon a straight sword you barely know how to wield. This was the fate of the Endabata, condemned criminals forced to fight blindfolded in one of the Colosseum's most bizarre spectacles. These fighters, often prisoners of war or those guilty of heinous crimes, were equipped with a heavy sealed helmet that blocked both sight and sound, rendering them helpless in the face of their equally blind opponent. The helmet, far from protective, was a cruel instrument of disorientation, its weight pressing down on the shoulders, its darkness amplifying the terror of the unknown. The arena would fall silent as the Andabate were led out, their stumbling steps echoing in the vast amphitheater. The crowd, roaring with laughter, saw this not as a battle, but as a grim comedy. The fighters, unable to see or hear, resorted to what was known as the swing and pray method, wild, desperate slashes into the void, hoping to strike their opponent by sheer luck. The sand of the Colosseum floor would soon be stained red, as the fighters hacked blindly, their swords occasionally finding flesh. The victor was determined not by skill, but by survival. The last man standing, gasping for breath, was declared the winner, though winning was a hollow victory. What made this matchup particularly cruel was its psychological toll. The Andabata were often men already broken by imprisonment, their spirits crushed by the knowledge that their death would serve as entertainment. The Romans, with their penchant for spectacle, found humor in this chaos, viewing it as a light-hearted interlude between more serious battles. Yet for the fighters, each swing was a gamble with death, their isolation in the helmet's darkness, a metaphor for their abandonment by society. The unfairness of this matchup might seem balanced. At first, both fighters were equally disadvantaged, after all. But consider the aftermath. A rare victor, bloodied and exhausted, would be granted not freedom, but another blind fight and another, until their luck inevitably ran out. Survival was merely a delay of the inevitable, a cruel prolongation of suffering in an arena where mercy was a foreign concept. The Andabate fights, though less bloody than some, set the stage for the escalating brutality of the Colosseum spectacles. Few spectacles in the Colosseum were as grandiose or as deadly as the Naumachia mock naval battles that transformed the arena into a watery battlefield. To stage these events, the Romans employed ingenious engineering, flooding the Colosseum's floor with water through a complex system of aqueducts and drains. The arena became a miniature sea, complete with small ships, often replicas of Roman or enemy vessels, manned by thousands of prisoners, slaves, or condemned criminals. These battles, first introduced by Julius Caesar in 46 BC, and later popularized by emperors like Claudius and Nero, were among the most expensive and logistically challenging events in Roman history. Picture the scene: the Colosseum, filled with water shimmering under the Roman sun, a dozen ships bobbing precariously as the crowd roared in anticipation. Each ship carried a crew of desperate men, armed with spears, swords, and rudimentary naval weapons. The objective was simple: sink or be sunk, but the odds were anything but equal. The starting position of a ship could determine its fate. A vessel caught between two others was an easy target, its crew overwhelmed in a pincer attack before they could even organize a defense. The Dilmasic's water churned red with blood as ships rammed each other, men leaping onto enemy decks in frenzied combat, their weapons glinting in the sunlight. The unfairness of the Naumachia lay in its randomness and scale. Some crews, by chance, started in advantageous positions, able to maneuver freely and pick off weaker opponents. Others were doomed from the start, trapped in tight formations with no escape. Survival often depended on luck rather than skill, and even the most cunning strategies, such as hiding below deck to avoid early combat, offered little hope against the relentless slaughter. The battles ended when only one ship or team remained, the water littered with bodies and wreckage. Cleaning up after a Naumachia was a grim task. The Romans would remove large debris-broken masts, shattered oars before opening the drains, flushing the bloody water downstream like a grotesque river. The remains, human and otherwise, were left for downstream towns to deal with, a stark reminder of Rome's indifference to the suffering of its victims. These battles, while visually stunning, were a testament to the empire's extravagance and cruelty, sacrificing thousands of lives for a fleeting spectacle. Gladiator fights were the heart and soul of the Colosseum, the main event that drew the largest crowds and the most fervent cheers. These battles pitted highly trained warriors against one another, their skills honed in gladiatorial schools across the empire. Yet, despite their reputation for valor, many gladiatorial matchups were deliberately unfair, designed to maximize drama and bloodshed rather than ensure a fair contest. With over 20 classes of gladiators, each with distinct weapons, armor, and fighting styles, emperors and organizers could craft matchups that favored one fighter over another, ensuring a spectacle that thrilled the bloodthirsty crowd. Consider the matchup between the Retiarius and the Secutor. The Retiarius, lightly armored, wielded a net, trident, and dagger, relying on speed and cunning. The Secutor, by contrast, was a walking fortress, clad in heavy armor, a large shield, and a short sword, designed to withstand prolonged assaults. At first glance, the Secutor might seem invincible, but the Retiarius held a distinct advantage. By keeping his distance, the Retiarius could entangle the Secutor in his net, immobilizing him long enough to strike with the trident. The Secutor's heavy armor slowed him down, making him vulnerable to the Retiarius' agility. The crowd loved the drama of this David and Goliath struggle, but for the Secutor, the odds were stacked against him from the start. Another iconic matchup was the Murmillo versus the Threx. The Murmillo, armed with a large rectangular shield and a short sword, was a powerhouse of brute strength. The Threx, with a lighter curved sword and smaller shield, relied on speed and precision. The Threx's agility often allowed him to outmaneuver the Murmillo, tiring him out before landing a fatal blow. These stylistic differences were no accident. Organizers chose matchups to exploit weaknesses, ensuring that one fighter's strengths directly countered the others, creating a predictable outcome disguised as a fair fight. Not all gladiator fights ended in death, contrary to popular belief. Skilled gladiators were valuable assets, and their deaths were costly. A defeated fighter could surrender by raising a finger, pleading for mercy, which the crowd or emperor might grant. However, mercy was rare, and the loser's fate often depended on the whims of the mob. The unfairness of these matchups lay not only in the mismatched styles, but in the psychological pressure on the fighters, who knew that their survival hinged on entertaining a fickle audience. The Colosseum wasn't just a stage for human combat. Animals, too, were subjected to brutal and unfair matchups. The Romans imported exotic creatures from across their empire: lions, tigers, elephants, rhinos, and more, forcing them into deadly battles against each other or human opponents. These spectacles, known as venations, were wildly popular, often resulting in the slaughter of thousands of animals in a single day. The environmental toll was catastrophic, driving species like the North African elephant and the Caspian tiger to extinction. One of the most famous animal matchups was the elephant versus the rhinoceros. Picture an enraged rhinoceros, its thick hide scarred from captivity, charging an elephant, a towering beast armed with tusks and a massive trunk. In one recorded instance, the elephant seized a spear with its trunk, blinding the rhino by gouging its eyes, a shocking display of cunning that thrilled the crowd. Another popular matchup was the lion versus the tiger, a contest heavily favoring the lion, whose strength and social hunting instincts gave it a clear edge. Historical records note only one instance of a tiger defeating a lion, a rare upset that likely sparked heated debates among Roman bettors. The elephant versus bull matchup was perhaps the most lopsided. An elephant, weighing up to 14,000 pounds, towered over the bull, which stood little chance despite its ferocity. To heighten the drama, the Romans sometimes chained the animals together, forcing a confrontation that inevitably ended with the bull's demise. Other matchups, such as rhinos versus bears, crocodiles versus hippos, or lions versus hyenas, were equally brutal, their outcomes predetermined by the animals' physical disparities. These battles were not just displays of violence, but reflections of Roman power, showcasing the empire's ability to conquer nature itself. The animals, often starved or provoked to increase their aggression, had no chance to escape their fate. The crowd's cheers drowned out the roars of dying beasts, their blood soaking the arena as the Romans celebrated their dominion over the natural world. The 1 versus 2 matchup was a study in calculated unfairness, its outcome hinging on the circumstances of the fight. In one scenario, a skilled gladiator faced 2 untrained prisoners, a setup akin to a lion hunting lambs. The prisoners, often handed weapons they barely understood, stood little chance against a seasoned warrior. Their clumsy attempts to fight were met with swift, brutal efficiency, their bodies left broken on the arena floor. A slightly fairer version involved 3 trained gladiators, 1 heavily armored fighter against 2 lightly equipped opponents. The lone gladiator, clad in heavy armor and wielding a superior weapon, faced a duo armed with minimal protection and inferior blades. The pair's success depended on teamwork, a rare commodity in the high-stakes chaos of the Colosseum. Coordination was difficult under the pressure of imminent death, and the better-equipped gladiator often prevailed, exploiting the duo's lack of cohesion. In larger battles, the odds could shift dramatically. A single gladiator might find himself facing multiple opponents due to the chaotic nature of mass combat, where alliances crumbled and luck played a cruel role. These scenarios were less about skill and more about survival, with the crowd delighting in the unpredictable carnage. The unfairness lay in the sheer randomness of the odds, turning skilled fighters into victims of circumstance. Among the most peculiar and poorly documented matchups was the woman versus dwarf contest, introduced by Emperor Domitian in the late 1st century AD. Held at night under flickering torchlight, these battles were as much about spectacle as combat. The female fighter, often a trained gladiatrix, had the advantage of reach and size, her muscular frame honed by rigorous training. Archaeological evidence, such as the remains of a female gladiator found in England in 2010, suggests these women were exceptionally strong. their bones thickened by intense physical conditioning. The dwarf, typically a male with a condition like achondroplasia, was shorter, but potentially stronger and more agile, relying on speed and unconventional tactics. Historical records are vague on the outcomes, leaving the fairness of the matchup open to speculation. The woman's reach and training likely gave her an edge, but the dwarf's resilience and unpredictability could turn the tide. The crowd, enthralled by the novelty, cared little for fairness, cheering wildly as the torchlit arena echoed with clashing steel. The lack of clear records reflects the Romans' view of these fights as mere curiosities, not serious contests. Yet, the very existence of such matchups underscores the Colosseum's role as a theater of cruelty, where even the marginalized were pitted against each other for amusement. The wild animal hunts, or venations, were among the Colosseum's most unique and horrifying spectacles. The arena was transformed into a simulated wilderness, complete with trees, rocks, and artificial landscapes to mimic the animals' natural habitats. Armed with spears, bows, or small shields, hunters ranging from trained venators to condemned criminals faced a menagerie of predators: lions, tigers, bears, leopards, rhinos, and more. The animals were often released gradually, building suspense, though some events saw a sudden flood of beasts, overwhelming the hunters in a frenzy of claws and teeth. Trained venatores had a fighting chance, their skills honed through years of hunting. Condemned criminals, however, were lambs to the slaughter, their makeshift weapons useless against ravenous predators. The animals, starved for days to heighten their aggression, tore through their opponents with terrifying efficiency. The crowd roared as blood sprayed across the sand, the hunters' screams drowned out by the cacophony of cheers. The variety of animals was staggering. From elephants and crocodiles to ostriches and giraffes, many shipped from distant corners of the empire at great expense. These hunts were not just entertainment, but a display of Rome's global reach, its ability to subjugate both man and beast. The unfairness was stark. No amount of courage could save an untrained prisoner from a lion's jaws, and the spectacle's purpose was to revel in that inevitability. Man versus beast battles were the second most popular events in the Colosseum, surpassed only by gladiator fights. These contests came in two forms, each tailored for maximum entertainment. In the first, a bestiaris, a professional fighter trained to battle animals, faced a formidable beast, such as a lion, tiger, or bear. Armed with spears, nets, or swords, the bestiaris relied on skill and strategy to prevail, often emerging victorious despite the odds. These battles were thrilling displays of human prowess, though even the best fighters risked severe injury or death. The second form was far bloodier. Condemned criminals or prisoners of war, untrained and poorly armed, were pitted against starved predators. These men stood no chance, their deaths a foregone conclusion as the animals tore them apart. One infamous lion reportedly killed over 200 men before its defeat, a testament to the animal's ferocity and the prisoner's helplessness. These executions, repeated frequently, were a chilling reminder of Rome's merciless justice. The unfairness of these matchups was blatant. The bestiarius had training and weapons, but the condemned had nothing but their fear. The animals, driven to madness by hunger, were unstoppable forces, their natural instincts weaponized for the crowd's amusement. Few matchups were as lopsided as the prisoner versus professional gladiator. A seasoned gladiator, whether a trained slave or a volunteer from a gladiatorial school, was a master of combat, his skills sharpened by countless battles. The prisoner, often a criminal or captive with no fighting experience, was handed a weapon and pushed into the arena to face certain death. The gladiator's armor gleamed under the sun, his movements precise and lethal, while the prisoner stumbled, clutching a sword he barely knew how to hold. The crowd reveled in this mismatch, cheering as the gladiator dispatched his opponent with brutal efficiency. For the prisoner, The fight was a public execution, a humiliating end to a life already stripped of dignity. The gladiator, meanwhile, was a celebrity, his victory celebrated with roars of approval. The unfairness was not just in the skill gap, but in the psychological torment. The prisoner knew his fate, yet had no choice but to fight, his death a spectacle for the masses. At the pinnacle of unfairness were the rigged matches orchestrated by Emperor Commodus, who ruled Rome from 180 to 192 A. A narcissist obsessed with gladiatorial glory, Commodus fought in the Colosseum himself, styling himself as a heroic warrior. But his battles were far from fair. Trained by the best instructors in Rome, Commodus was a skilled swordsman, yet he ensured victory by rigging the odds. His opponents, often prisoners or lesser gladiators, were secretly injured before the fight, their wounds hidden beneath armor, but severe enough to cripple their performance. A slashed tendon or broken bone rendered them helpless, ensuring Commodus's triumph. Commodus also fought untrained men, their lack of skill guaranteeing his victory. He faced animals too, slaughtering lions, ostriches, and even 3 elephants, which were reportedly wounded or restrained to ensure his success. His undefeated record, spanning hundreds of fights, was a sham, propped up by manipulation and brutality. During the plebeian games of 192 A, he killed hundreds of animals daily with arrows and javelins, a grotesque display of power that drained the Roman treasury. Ironically, Commodus's obsession with glory led to his downfall. In December 192 AD, he was strangled in his bath by a wrestler named Narcissus, a humiliating end for a man who craved immortal fame. His rigged matches remain a stark symbol of the Colosseum's darkest excesses, where power and deceit trumped honor and skill. The most horrific punishments in history, throughout history, humanity has devised punishments so cruel and depraved that they linger in the collective memory as testaments to the depths of human cruelty. From medieval Europe to ancient empires, these punishments were designed not only to inflict pain, but to instill terror, deter rebellion, and assert dominance. Often reserved for criminals, traitors, or those who defied the ruling powers, these tortures were public spectacles, drawing crowds eager to witness suffering. Let us journey through these nightmarish punishments, starting with the grim and escalating to the utterly unthinkable, exploring the historical context, the victims' experiences, and the societies that sanction such horrors. In the shadow of the Tower of London, a fortress synonymous with dread, lay the Rat Dungeon, a subterranean cell that struck fear into the hearts of even the most hardened criminals. This was no ordinary prison. Located at the tower's lowest depths, below the waterline of the nearby River Thames, the dungeon was a pitch-black chamber where prisoners were shackled to the damp stone walls, their wrists and ankles bound by rusted chains. The air was thick with the stench of mildew and decay, a silence broken only by the distant drip of water seeping through the walls. What made the Rat Dungeon uniquely horrifying was its connection to the river. During high tides or storms, the rising waters would flood the riverbanks, driving hordes of rats hungry, aggressive, and desperate from their burrows. These rats, displaced by the deluge, would swim downstream, their tiny claws scrabbling against the stone until they found the dungeon's entrance. For the prisoner, trapped in darkness, the first sign of their arrival was the faint skittering sound of rodent feet. Within moments, the noise multiplied, a cacophony of squeaks and scratches as hundreds of rats poured into the cell, their eyes glinting faintly in the gloom. The prisoner, unable to see or move, could only brace for the onslaught. The rats, driven by hunger, would begin to bite small, sharp nips at first, targeting the prisoner's exposed flesh. A desperate struggle might shake off a few for an hour or two, but exhaustion inevitably set in. As the prisoner collapsed, unconscious or semi-conscious, the rats would feast, their teeth tearing into skin, muscle, and even bone. Upon waking, the victim would find their body riddled with hundreds of oozing wounds, each bite a burning reminder of their helplessness. In the early medieval period, a rat dungeon was a punishment for serious crimes, treason, murder, or theft of royal property. But as the centuries passed, particularly in the later Middle Ages, it evolved into a form of execution. Prisoners were no longer retrieved after days or weeks. They were simply abandoned, left to the mercy of the rats until starvation, infection, or blood loss claimed them. The dungeon's darkness, its isolation, and the relentless torment of the rats made it a living nightmare, a punishment that lingered in London's lore as a fate worse than death. The rack, another grim fixture of the Tower of London, was a torture device that epitomized medieval cruelty. Used across Europe and beyond, from the Spanish Inquisition to the courts of Renaissance Italy, the rack was designed to extract confessions from criminals, heretics, or prisoners of war. Its construction was deceptively simple, a wooden frame, resembling a ladder, with rotating rollers at each end connected to a ratchet pulley system. The prisoner was laid on their back, their wrists and ankles bound to the rollers with coarse ropes that bit into the skin. As the interrogation began, two officials, often clad in dark robes, their faces impassive, would turn the rollers, tightening the ropes with each crank. The prisoner's body would stretch, the strain mounting on their shoulders, hips, knees, and elbows. Joints creaked, ligaments tore, and bones popped from their sockets, each turn amplifying the agony. The rack's purpose was to break the prisoner's will, forcing them to confess to crimes real or imagined. Yet, in a cruel twist, the truth was often irrelevant. If the confession satisfied the interrogators, the prisoner might be released often, crippled or paralyzed. If not, the torture continued, the rollers turning until the victim's body was a ruin of dislocated limbs. One harrowing case is that of Anne Askew, a 25-year-old Englishwoman tortured in 1546. A Protestant in a time when Catholicism dominated England, Anne was arrested for preaching biblical scriptures to a small group of women, an act deemed heretical. Refusing to name her companions, she was subjected to hours on the rack, her joints wrenched apart until she was completely paralyzed. Carried to the stake in a chair, she was burned alive, her defiance a testament to her faith, but also a grim reflection of the rack's brutality. The rack was not just a tool of torture, but a symbol of a society that valued conformity over justice, where dissent was crushed with mechanical precision. At sea, where the law was as harsh as the ocean, keel hauling emerged as a punishment so brutal it often ended in death. Common in the 16th and 17th centuries among European navies, particularly the Dutch and British, keel hauling was reserved for sailors who committed serious offenses, stealing rations, assaulting crewmates, or mutiny. The process was as simple as it was horrific. The sailor was tied with ropes around his arms and legs. The rope looped around the ship's hull and secured to ensure a tight grip. With a heave, the crew would cast him overboard, dragging him beneath the ship's keel, the sharp, barnacle-encrusted spine of the vessel. As the sailor was pulled through the water, he faced multiple threats. Drowning was a constant risk, the cold sea filling his lungs as he struggled for air. The barnacles, razor-sharp and encrusted with marine life, acted like a cheese grater, slicing through skin and muscle, leaving trails of blood in the water. The keel itself, a massive wooden beam, could break bones or snap the neck if the sailor collided with it. The crew's effort determined the speed and force of the drag, and a vengeful or overzealous team could ensure a quick death or a prolonged one. Survivors were rare, but their fates were grim. Some were sent for a second round, ensuring death. Others, pulled back aboard, succumbed to infections from their wounds, their bodies marred by scars that marked them as pariahs. In rare cases, a sailor might survive and return to duty, his body a testament to the punishment's cruelty. Keel hauling was not just a punishment, but a warning to the crew. Disobedience at sea would be met with unrelenting savagery. The ocean, itself an accomplice in the sailor's demise. Few punishments were as theatrical or as terrifying as execution by elephant, a method used across Asia, most notably in India during the Mughal Empire as late as the 19th century. Reserved for crimes ranging from tax evasion to rebellion, this punishment was a public spectacle designed to showcase the ruler's power over both man and beast. The executioner, perched atop a trained elephant, guided the massive creature, with precision, turning a living animal into an instrument of death. The execution took several forms, each more horrific than the last. In the merciful method, the prisoner's arms were tied behind their back, and their head was placed on a pedestal. With a single deliberate step, the elephant's foot crushed the skull, death coming swiftly as blood and bone splattered across the ground. In a slower, more sadistic variant, the prisoner was laid flat, arms bound, as the elephant was guided to walk over their body. A misstep might crush a limb, leaving the victim alive but in agony, requiring multiple passes to complete the execution. The most gruesome method involved the elephant systematically crushing each limb, arms, legs, then torso sometimes, puncturing the body with its tusks for added spectacle. Historical accounts, such as those from the Mughal Emperor Jahangir in the early 17th century, describe mass executions where dozens of prisoners, tax evaders, thieves, or enemy soldiers were crushed in a single day, simply to alleviate the emperor's boredom. The crowd, gathered in a dusty plaza, would cheer as the elephant trumpeted, its handler basking in the display of control. This punishment was not just about death, but about power, the ruler's ability to command even the mightiest of creatures, to do their bidding. Impalement ranks among the most gruesome punishments in history, used by civilizations from the Ottoman Empire to ancient Egypt as recently as the 17th century. Reserved for highway robbers, grave thieves, or rebels, this execution was both a physical and psychological torment. The process began with the prisoner laid face down, their arms tied behind their back. A razor-sharp blade would slice open their lower back, the wound immediately coated with a paste to staunch the bleeding, a cruel measure to prolong suffering. A wooden stake, as thick as a man's arm and sharply tapered, was then inserted into the incision, greased to ease its passage. Executioners would hammer the stake deeper with a mallet, driving it through the body until it emerged from the shoulder, neck, or mouth. The victim, writhing in agony, was then hoisted upright and planted beside a busy road, their impaled body a grotesque warning to passers-by. In some cases, the stake was driven just deep enough to hold the victim in place without immediate death, a seat-like structure preventing them from sliding down. Left to suffer for hours, they would beg for mercy from indifferent crowds until death finally claimed them. The public nature of impalement amplified its horror. Displayed along trade routes or city gates, the bodies served as grim reminders of the consequences of defying the law. The stench of decay would linger for days, a sight of rotting flesh etched into the memories of all who passed. This punishment, used by figures like Vlad the Impaler in 15th century Wallachia, was as much about terrorizing the living as punishing the guilty. Known as ponacole Latin for penalty of the sack, this Roman punishment was reserved for the heinous crime of parricide, the murder of a family member. First documented in the 2nd century BC, it persisted into the 18th century in Germanic regions. The condemned was sewn into a thick leather sack, but not alone. To ensure a gruesome demise, a dog, rooster, viper, and monkey were added. There, presents a mystery of cruelty, perhaps a symbolic representation of chaos, or simply a means to heighten the horror. The sack, sealed nearly airtight, was thrown into a river or the sea, the prisoner trapped with the frantic animals. The dog's barks, the rooster's crows, the viper's hisses, and the monkey's screeches created a cacophony of terror as the creatures clawed and bit in their desperation to escape. The prisoner, suffocating in the stifling darkness, faced not only drowning, but the relentless attacks of their unwilling companions. In later centuries, some were offered a grim choice: the sack or death in the Colosseum, mauled by beasts before a cheering crowd. Neither option offered hope, only a different flavor of despair. The ponacole was a ritual of exclusion, casting the parasite out of society in a manner that underscored their betrayal. The animals, innocent yet doomed, added a layer of absurdity to the punishment, reflecting Rome's penchant for theatrical cruelty. The sack's plunge into the water was a final act of erasure, the prisoner's screams swallowed by the depths. Rats, those ubiquitous scavengers, were weaponized in two particularly sadistic punishments. The first, documented during the 80 Years' War in 1568, was employed by Dutch leader Diederik Sonoy. A prisoner was strapped down, and a clay bowl containing a rat was placed upside down on their stomach, chest, or groin. The bowl's exterior was heated with a torch or coals, driving the rat into a frenzy. With no escape, but through the prisoner's flesh, the rat would burrow inward, its teeth tearing through skin, muscle, and organs in a desperate bid for survival. The prisoner's screams echoed as the rat carved a bloody path, often emerging, alive while the victim perished in agony. The second method, known as the rectoscope, was even more horrific, used under Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet in the 1970s. A tube was inserted into the prisoner's rectum, and a rat was released. Inside, the animal, panicked and confined, would burrow through the prisoner's intestines, causing unimaginable pain. Interrogators would demand answers during this torture, the prisoner's cries drowned out by their own torment. The secrecy of this method, coupled with the disappearance of countless victims, underscores its brutality. Both punishments exploited the rat's instinct to survive, turning a small creature into a lethal instrument of death. Gibbeting, the practice of displaying criminals in cages, was a public punishment that lingered into the early 20th century. With documented use in Afghanistan in 1921, in 17th and 18th century England, it was a favorite for traitors, murderers, and pirates, particularly after the 1752 Murder Act mandated public dissection or gibbeting for convicted murderers. The cages, forged from iron and shaped to fit the human body, were so tight that movement was impossible, the metal biting into the skin with every attempt to shift. Hoisted 30 feet above a busy road or harbor, the prisoner was left to die of starvation, dehydration, or exposure, their pleas for water or mercy ignored by passers-by. The cage's public placement ensured maximum humiliation, the prisoner's suffering a warning to all. After death, the body was left to rot, sometimes for decades, the stench of decay permeating nearby villages. In England, complaints about the smell led to rare cleanups, but in places like Boston, Massachusetts, pirate cages at the harbor served as grim landmarks for arriving ships. The psychological toll was immense. Trapped in a metal prison, the prisoner could see and hear the world they were no longer part of, their isolation and torment as potent as the physical pain. Gibbeting was not just a punishment, but a spectacle of degradation, reducing a human to a rotting exhibit for the edification of the masses. Scaphism, used by the ancient Persian Empire, was a punishment of unparalleled cruelty, reserved for murderers and traitors. A victim was placed inside a small boat, their arms and legs protruding through holes to dangle in the water. Force-fed milk and honey until their stomachs swelled. They were then slathered with a mixture, a sweet lure for insects and rodents. The boat was set adrift on a stagnant lake, exposed to the blistering sun where the real horror began. Milk and honey triggered severe diarrhea, the stench attracting flies, wasps, bees, and rats. These creatures swarmed the prisoner, burrowing into their flesh, laying eggs in open wounds, and feeding on the living body. Each day, the victim was fed more milk and honey, prolonging their suffering. Historical accounts, such as those by Byzantine writer Joannes Anaras, describe victims enduring up to 17 days of torment, their bodies rotting alive, covered in parasites and worms. The combination of starvation, infection, and relentless animal attacks made scaphism a slow, excruciating descent into death, a punishment designed to maximize suffering and terror. The oubliette, from the French word meaning to forget, was the ultimate punishment of erasure. Used across medieval Europe, including in the Tower of London's Little Ease cell and Warwick Castle's dungeons, the oubliette was a narrow, stone-lined chamber, often underground, with a single metal door. Too small to allow sitting, standing, or lying down comfortably, it forced prisoners into contorted positions, their bodies aching from the confinement. Pitch black and silent, the cell was a void of sensory deprivation, amplifying the prisoners. Despair? Prisoners were tossed into the oubliette and forgotten, left to die of dehydration or starvation within days, if they were lucky. Many cells contained the rotting remains of previous occupants, the stench of decay a constant reminder of the prisoner's fate. Rats, thriving in the damp darkness, would gnaw at the living and the dead, their bites adding to the torment. In some cases, prisoners were kept alive with minimal food and water, their suffering prolonged for years, their only connection to the world, the faint sounds of life beyond the cell's walls. Archaeological discoveries, such as the oubliette at Leap Castle in Ireland, revealed chambers filled with dozens of skeletons, evidence of their grim purpose. Found in 1900 behind a chapel wall, the Leap Castle oubliette required multiple cartloads to clear its remains, a testament to its frequent use. The oubliette was not just a punishment, but an act of obliteration, erasing the prisoner from existence, their screams unheard, their lives forgotten by all but the rats that shared their tomb. The most terrifying treatments for mental illness in history. In the annals of medical history, the treatment of mental illness has often veered into the realm of horror, with methods so brutal they seem more like torture than therapy. From the 18th to the 20th centuries, particularly in Europe and the United States, asylums were testing grounds for experiments that promised cures but delivered suffering. These treatments, born from misguided theories and a profound misunderstanding of mental health, were often inflicted on the most vulnerable, those deemed insane by a society quick to judge and slow to empathize. Let us explore these nightmarish practices, starting with the terrifying and escalating to those that were worse than death, delving into the experiences of patients, the rationale of practitioners, and the chilling legacy of these so-called cures. In the asylums of 18th and 19th century Europe and America, rotational therapy emerged as a bizarre and torturous attempt to cure mental illness. The device was deceptively simple: a wooden chair suspended from the ceiling or mounted on a rotating base, into which patients were strapped tightly with leather restraints. The air in the asylum's treatment room was heavy with the smell of sweat and fear, the chair creaking ominously as it began to spin. Attendants, often burly men tasked with operating the device, would crank a lever, sending the patient into a dizzying whirl, sometimes a gentle few rotations per minute, other times a stomach-churning 100 revolutions per minute. For the patient, the experience was pure torment. The world blurred into a nauseating spiral, the chair's relentless motion inducing vertigo and vomiting. The patient's screams, if they could muster them, were drowned out by the rhythmic clank of the mechanism. Some, overwhelmed by the sensory assault, would pass out, their bodies slumping against the restraints, only to awaken disoriented, their stomachs empty, and their minds no clearer. The theory behind this madness, championed by physicians like Erasmus Darwin, held that extreme dizziness could reset the brain, purging it of disordered thoughts. In reality, it left patients traumatized, their trust in their caregivers shattered. Rotational therapy was not just a medical failure, but a reflection of the era's desperation to control mental illness. Asylums, often overcrowded and underfunded, were places of confinement rather than healing, and treatments like this were as much about subduing patients as curing them. The attendants, meanwhile, found their own grim satisfaction in the physical exertion, their muscles straining as they spun the chair, indifferent to the human cost. Moral therapy, at first glance, sounds benign, a method to guide patients toward better behavior through discipline. But in the asylums of the 18th and 19th centuries, it was a cruel system of punishment disguised as treatment, developed by figures like Philippe Pinel in France. Moral therapy aimed to reform patients through strict rules and consequences, assuming that mental illness stemmed from moral weakness. In practice, it became a tool for oppression, particularly for patients whose conditions, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or severe depression, made compliance nearly impossible. Imagine a cavernous asylum ward, its stone walls echoing with the cries of patients and the stern commands of staff. Patients who forgot rules or acted out were subjected to a litany of punishments: savage beatings with leather straps, confinement in dark cells without food, or restraint in straitjackets that chafed their skin raw. Some were forced to endure the cold water treatment, doused with icy water to shock them into submission, while others were strapped into the dreaded rotating chairs of rotational therapy. In a particularly absurd punishment, patients were made to eat an entire bag of stale circus peanuts, the sickly sweet candy gagging them as attendants watched with grim amusement. A lack of oversight was the true horror. Asylum staff, often untrained and overworked, had near total authority to punish as they saw fit, turning moral therapy into a cycle of abuse. For patients, the constant fear of punishment, coupled with their inability to meet impossible standards, deepened their despair, driving some further into madness. Moral therapy revealed the dark underbelly of asylums, where control trumped compassion, and patients were less patients than prisoners. Hydrotherapy, used from the 18th to the 20th centuries in the United States and Europe, was a chilling array of water-based treatments that promised to soothe the mind, but often pushed patients to the brink of survival. The methods were as varied as they were cruel, each exploiting water's elemental power to shock and subdue. In the baths of surprise, patients were led onto a wooden bridge over a tank of icy water, the air thick with the damp chill of the asylum's basement. Without warning, a trapdoor would open, plunging them into the freezing depths below. The shock, practitioners believed, would jolt the mind back to sanity, but it left patients gasping, their hearts pounding with terror. The dunking baths were no less brutal. Patients were strapped into a metal cage, their limbs bound tightly, and lowered into a frigid lake or tank. The submersion was repeated until the patients shivered uncontrollably, their lips blue and their bodies trembling on the edge of hypothermia, sign, inexplicably, that the treatment was working. The wet towel treatment wrapped patients in ice-cold, dripping towels, encasing them from head to toe for hours, the cold seeping into their bones. The long baths were perhaps the most inhumane, with patients submerged in water for days, only their heads above the surface, straps ensuring they couldn't escape the numbing torment. The rationale, rooted in the belief that water could calm the nerves, was a tragic miscalculation. Forced immersion caused physical harm, hypothermia, infections, and even heart failure, and deepened patients' trauma. Hydrotherapy's legacy is a stark reminder of how far medicine strayed in its quest to control the uncontrollable, turning a source of life into an instrument of suffering. Solitary confinement, widely used in 18th and 19th century asylums, was a punishment masquerading as therapy. Patients were locked in small, windowless cells, the darkness so absolute it seemed to swallow sound itself. For those with severe mental illnesses, paranoia, hallucinations, or mania, the isolation was a descent into terror. Left alone for hours, days, or even weeks, patients had no sense of time, their only companions the echoes of their own thoughts or the skittering of rats across the stone floor. Many, consumed by fear or desperation, would hurl themselves against the walls, their bodies bruised and bloodied in futile attempts to escape. The introduction of straitjackets in the late 18th century, meant to prevent self-harm, only heightened the horror, binding patients' arms while leaving them free to ram their heads or shoulders into the cell's unforgiving surfaces. By the 19th century, asylums began using padded cells to curb injuries, but this only prolonged confinement, allowing staff to leave patients in isolation for even longer periods. The theory behind solitary confinement was that isolation would force introspection and reform, but for most patients, it exacerbated their conditions, driving them deeper into psychosis or despair. The practice exposed the cruelty of asylums, where patients were punished for their illnesses rather than treated, their suffering hidden behind locked doors. The tranquilizing chair, pioneered by American physician Benjamin Rush in the late 18th century, was a device of deceptive simplicity and profound cruelty. Patients were strapped into a wooden chair, their arms, legs, chest, and head secured with leather restraints so tight they could barely breathe. A bucket beneath caught their waist, adding to the humiliation, while a small box was placed over their head, limiting their vision to a narrow sliver of the world. The room, often a dimly lit chamber in the asylum's depths, was silent save for the patient's labored breathing and the occasional groan of the chair's wood. Rush believed that mental illness stemmed from disrupted blood circulation or sensory overload, and by immobilizing the body, the chair would redirect blood to the brain, restoring balance. Patients were left in the chair for hours, sometimes days, their muscles cramping, their minds unraveling in the enforced stillness. The sensory deprivation and physical discomfort were torturous, yet Rush saw the chair as a humane alternative to other methods, a grim irony given its impact. For patients, the tranquilizing chair was a prison of both body and mind, stripping them of agency and dignity. Its use, widespread in American asylums through the early 19th century, reflected a medical establishment more concerned with control than cure, its legacy a haunting reminder of the era's misguided compassion. Restraint cages, used from the 19th to early 20th centuries, were exactly as brutal as they sound. These metal or wooden enclosures, ranging from slightly roomy to so tight they prevented movement, were designed to confine patients deemed unruly or dangerous. The cages, often placed in the asylum's darkest corners, were cold and unforgiving, the bars biting into the skin of those who pressed against them. Patients were locked inside for hours or days, the duration tied to the perceived severity of their condition. The more insane, the longer the confinement. The theory was that cages would force reflection and reform, but for patients with mental illnesses, this was impossible. Instead, the isolation and confinement deepened their distress, their cries echoing through the asylum's halls. Some cages allowed a few steps, offering a cruel illusion of freedom, while others were so constrictive that patients could only stand or crouch, their bodies aching from the unnatural positions. Restraint cages were a stark symbol of the asylum's punitive approach, treating patients as animals to be caged rather than humans to be healed. The psychological toll was immense, with many emerging more disturbed than before, their spirits broken by the relentless confinement. Bloodletting, one of history's most enduring and horrific medical practices, was used from ancient times to the early 20th century to treat a range of ailments, including mental illness. In asylums, patients were subjected to repeated sessions where physicians wielded lancets or leeches to drain bad blood believed to cause insanity. The procedure took place in sterile, cold rooms, the patient's arm or leg sliced open, blood pooling in bowls as their strength ebbed away. The air was thick with the metallic tongue of blood, the patient's face growing pale as the draining continued. The amount of blood removed depended on the patient's condition. Those deemed severely ill were bled until they were weak, their bodies shriveled like raisins, as one physician grimly noted. When no improvement was seen, the solution was to bleed more, a logic that led to infections, fainting, and death. The practice, rooted in humoral theory, assumed that balancing the body's fluids would restore mental clarity, but it only weakened patients, exacerbating their suffering. Bloodletting's persistence in asylums reflected a medical culture resistant to change, where tradition trumped evidence, and patients paid the price with their lives or health. Its legacy is a chilling reminder of how far medicine could stray. In the name of healing, fever therapy, prevalent in the 20th century, was a desperate and deadly attempt to cure mental illness by inducing high fevers. Patients were injected with malaria-infected blood, sending their bodies into a feverish spiral that could last weeks. The treatment room, often a stark ward filled with the moans of the afflicted, was a battleground where patients fought for survival. Those who recovered from the initial fever were subjected to 8 to 12 additional rounds, a grueling cycle that could span 6 months. The theory, based on observations that fever sometimes alleviated physical illnesses, posited that high temperatures could burn out mental disorders. When results were lackluster, some physicians escalated the horror by injecting malaria directly into the brain, a practice that killed approximately 15% of the over 1,000 patients subjected to it. Survivors faced lingering effects, weakness, organ damage, or death from secondary infections. Fever therapy's failure was a tragic lesson in the dangers of speculative medicine, its victims a testament to the era's reckless experimentation. Insulin shock therapy, used from the 1920s to the 1950s in countries like the US, Canada, UK, China, and Korea, was a brutal procedure that pushed patients to the edge of death. In a sterile hospital room, patients were strapped to beds, their veins injected with massive doses of insulin to induce hypoglycemia and coma. The procedure was violent. Patients thrashed, their bodies convulsing, sometimes dislocating joints or breaking bones in their struggles. The air was filled with the sounds of their gasps and the creak of restraints. After hours in a coma, patients were revived with glucose, only to face another dose the next day. This cycle could continue for months, with some enduring it for over 2 years. The side effects were devastating: obesity from glycogen storage disease, seizures, brain damage, and death. Physicians, like Manfred Sakel, who pioneered the method, believed comas could jolt patients out of psychosis. But the results were often catastrophic, with many survivors left unable to function independently. Insulin shock therapies. Popularity, despite its dangers, reflected the desperation of asylums to find quick fixes for complex disorders. Its legacy is one of tragedy, a stark reminder of the human cost of untested treatments. Electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, introduced in the 1930s by Italian psychiatrists Ugo Treletti and Lucio Bini, was inspired by the observation that electrically induced seizures calmed pigs before slaughter. In asylums worldwide, patients were strapped to tables, a rubber wedge jammed into their mouths to prevent tongue biting. Electrodes were attached to their temples, and with a flick of a switch, electricity surged through their brains, triggering seizures that could last minutes. The room was filled with the hum of the machine and the patients' muffled cries, their bodies jerking against the restraints. Unlike modern ECT, Early procedures were often performed without anesthesia, leaving patients fully conscious and terrified. Sessions were repeated daily or multiple times a day for weeks, with some enduring months of treatment. The fear of the procedure was so intense that patients would comply with any demand to avoid it, their compliance mistaken for improvement. Survivors often suffered severe PTSD, memory loss, or permanent cognitive impairment, their lives forever altered. ECT's initial success, based on patients' temporary calm, was overshadowed by its long-term harm. Its widespread use in asylums, from the U.S. to Europe, revealed a medical system more focused on control than care, its legacy a haunting chapter in psychiatric history. Trephination, practiced from ancient times to the 19th century, was one of the earliest surgical interventions for mental illness. Patients, sometimes willing but often coerced, were seated or strapped down as a practitioner wielded a drill, saw, or hammer to bore a hole into their skull. The procedure, performed without anesthesia, filled the air with the grinding sound of bone and the patient's agonized screams. Holes varied in size, from small punctures to openings as large as a tennis ball, placed anywhere on the skull in a quest to relieve pressure or, later, to release supposed evil spirits. In asylums, trephination was revived in the 19th century, with physicians believing it could cure chronic headaches or expel demons. The risks were staggering: infections, brain damage, and death were common, yet the practice persisted, driven by superstition and desperation. Tools evolved, from crude stone implements to metal drills, but the outcome remained grim. Trephination's endurance reflects a medical culture that prioritized intervention over understanding, leaving countless patients scarred or dead in the name of a cure. The lobotomy, developed in 1935 by Portuguese neurologist Antonio Egas Manes, stands as the most terrifying psychiatric experiment in history. In a sterile operating room, patients were strapped down as surgeons drilled holes into their skulls, injecting alcohol to destroy brain tissue or using a leucotoma, tool resembling an ice pick, to sever and remove chunks of the frontal lobe. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and the faint metallic tang of blood. The patient's face contorted in pain despite rudimentary anesthesia. Manes's procedure, which earned him a controversial Nobel Prize in 1949, promised to calm erratic behavior, but often left patients as shells of their former selves, unable to move limbs, speak coherently, or function independently. The most notorious practitioner, Walter Freeman, performed over 4,000 lobotomies in the U.S. from 1936 to 1967, perfecting his ice pick lobotomy. Inserting an ice pick through the eye socket, he would hammer it into the brain, scrambling the eye. Frontal lobe by feel alone. The procedure, performed in minutes, was a grotesque shortcut, with many patients dying or suffering severe brain damage. Lobotomies became a cultural phenomenon, with Freeman marketing them aggressively, even to non-patients seeking relief from minor issues. Over 100,000 procedures were performed worldwide, primarily in the 1950s and 1960s, leaving a trail of broken lives. The lobotomy's legacy is a chilling testament to the hubris of medical science, where ambition and ignorance combine to inflict unimaginable harm. The most terrifying prisons in history, prisons are designed to punish and deter, but some transcend their purpose, becoming nightmarish realms where humanity is stripped away. From the overcrowded slums of South America to the frozen labor camps of North Korea, these institutions are not just places of confinement, but monuments to cruelty, fear, and despair. Their walls have witnessed unimaginable suffering, their histories stained with blood and desperation. Let us explore these harrowing places, starting with the terrifying and escalating to those that embody hell on earth. Delving into the lives of the inmates, the systems that govern them, and the societies that allow such horrors to persist. Nestled on the shores of California's San Francisco Bay, San Quentin State Prison is a name synonymous with infamy. Established in 1852, it is one of the oldest and most notorious maximum security facilities in the United States, housing some of the country's most dangerous criminals. Its roster reads like a who's who of horror. Charles Manson, with his hypnotic charisma and murderous cult. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, whose reign of terror gripped Los Angeles. And William Bonin, the freeway killer, whose crimes chilled the nation. The prison's gray stone walls, topped with razor wire, loom over the bay, a constant reminder of the darkness within. What makes San Quentin terrifying is its brutal social hierarchy. New inmates face immediate pressure to join a gang, with affiliations often determined by race or ethnicity. The yard, a concrete expanse buzzing with tension, is a battleground where a misstep standing in the wrong spot or catching the wrong glance can lead to a shank in the ribs. The air is thick with the shouts of gang leaders and the clatter of makeshift weapons, the threat of violence ever present. For those who resist joining, survival depends on quick wits or an ambiguous appearance that buys time to prepare for a fight. Yet, San Quentin's reputation has softened in recent years, a paradox that sets it apart. Modern reforms have introduced programs like gardening, yoga, and art classes, transforming parts of the prison into an unlikely community center. Inmates can enroll in plumbing, culinary, or coding courses, preparing them for jobs post-release. Concerts and kickball games break the monotony, offering glimpses of normalcy. These changes reflect California's push for rehabilitation. But for many inmates, the threat of gang violence and the weight of their pasts make San Quentin a place where hope and horror coexist uneasily. In the heart of La Paz, Bolivia, San Pedro Prison is a surreal anomaly, a prison that operates more like a walled slum than a correctional facility. Built in the 19th century to house 600 inmates, it now holds around 3,000, plus hundreds of women and children who live alongside their incarcerated family members. The prison's high walls enclose a chaotic microcosm of society, with no guards inside, only police patrolling the perimeter. The air is thick with the smells of cooking, sweat, and decay. The narrow corridors, lined with makeshift stalls, selling everything from food to drugs. San Pedro is governed entirely by its inmates, who elect a boss to maintain order. This leader, supported by enforcers in black Adidas tracksuits, rules with an iron fist, their uniforms a practical choice for impromptu soccer matches or violent confrontations. The prison's economy thrives on drug production, with cocaine labs operating openly, fueling addiction among an estimated 60% of inmates. The constant haze of drug-used coca leaves soaked in chemicals or raw cocaine creates a volatile atmosphere where overdoses and murders are common. The lack of oversight allows corruption to flourish, with wealthier inmates buying better. Cells are influence, while the poor languish in squalor. The absence of guards makes San Pedro uniquely terrifying. Without external authority, disputes are settled with knives or fists, and the weak are preyed upon by the strong. Families living within the walls face the same dangers, their presence a stark reminder of the prison's blurred line between captivity and community. San Pedro's progressive facade, touted by Bolivian officials as innovative, masks a reality of lawlessness, where survival depends on navigating a treacherous social landscape. Bang Kwang Central Prison, known as the Bangkok Hilton, is a maximum security nightmare in Thailand, notorious for its harsh conditions and brutal punishments. Located just outside Bangkok, it houses inmates serving sentences of 30 years or more, including those awaiting execution by lethal injection, the only facility in Thailand to administer it. The prison's concrete walls, stained with age and humidity, enclose a world of suffering, where the clank of chains and the cries of inmates fill the air. New arrivals face a grim initiation, Their legs are shackled with iron chains, welded tightly by a prison blacksmith. Those unable to bribe the smith endure excruciatingly tight restraints, the metal cutting into their flesh, causing wounds and infections. For 3 months, inmates shuffle in agony, the chains a constant reminder of their captivity. The diet is equally punishing: 1 daily bowl of plain white rice, occasionally supplemented with fish head soup, barely enough to sustain life. Desperate inmates resort to eating rats, which serve as a currency, traded for cigarettes or scraps of food, their meat a grim delicacy in a place of scarcity. Drug-related crimes dominate Bangkwang's population, with many foreigners caught. Smuggling Thailand's heavily penalized narcotics. The prison's brutality extends beyond starvation and shackles. Guards routinely beat inmates, and drug abuse is rampant, fueled by smuggled substances. The psychological toll is immense, with the constant threat of execution looming over death row inmates, their final moments spent in a sterile chamber awaiting the needle. Bangkwang's blend of physical torment and despair makes it a place where survival is a daily battle against both body and mind. In El Salvador, the Centro de Confinamiento del Terrorismo, CECOT, is a fortress of fear, the largest prison in the Americas, capable of housing 40,000 inmates and currently holding around 15,000. Opened in 2023, it was built to contain members of El Salvador's notorious gangs, MC13 and Barrio 18, whose tattoos make their affiliations unmistakable. The prison's towering concrete walls and razor wire fences create an imposing silhouette, a symbol of the government's crackdown on gang violence under President Nayib Bukele. Inside, rival gang members, mortal enemies on the outside, are forced to coexist, their cells packed tightly under constant surveillance. The air is heavy with tension, the clanging of metal doors and the shouts of guards a constant backdrop. Any infraction leads to solitary confinement in a concrete isolation cell where darkness and silence amplify the prisoner's dread. Inmates receive just 30 minutes of exercise daily, conducted in an indoor cage, ensuring they never see the outside world. Most will never leave, their sentences stretching into eternity. What makes CECOT particularly terrifying is the presence of innocent prisoners swept up in mass arrests to meet police quotas. These individuals, never affiliated with gangs, face the same brutal conditions, their pleas for justice ignored. The prison's isolation, no visitors, no outdoor time, creates a psychological prison as oppressive as its physical one. CECOT's sterile efficiency and unyielding control make it a modern-day dungeon, where hope is extinguished as swiftly as freedom. Rikers Island, a sprawling jail complex in New York City, is a cesspool of violence and neglect, widely regarded as the most dangerous in the United States. Established in the 1930s, it houses a mix of pretrial detainees and convicted inmates, its overcrowded cells reeking of sweat, mold, and fear. In 2022, the facility recorded 491 inmate-on-inmate stabbings and slashings, a testament to its lawlessness. The air is thick with the sounds of fights, screams, and the clatter of metal trays, the chaos barely contained by understaffed guards. Rikers' terror stems from its lack of oversight, with a third of correctional officers absent on any given day. Entire units are left unsupervised, allowing inmates to run gambling rings, fight clubs, and drug trafficking operations. The prison's unsanitary conditions, leaking pipes, vermin-infested cells compound the misery, with inmates describing it as pure hell. Yet the high recidivism rate, 42% of inmates return to crime, suggests a perverse familiarity, as if Rikers' brutality breeds a cycle of despair and defiance. Correctional officers face their own dangers, with over 1,500 assaults reported in 2022, an average of 4 per day. The violence spares no one, making Rikers a battlefield where both inmates and staff are at risk. Its reputation as a place of unrelenting chaos underscores the failure of a system that punishes without reforming, leaving all who enter scarred by its savagery. Black Dolphin Prison, perched on the edge of Siberia, near Russia's border with Kazakhstan, is a fortress of despair for Russia's most dangerous criminals. Named for the dolphin statues outside, a cruel irony given its brutality, it houses 700 inmates serving life sentences, collectively responsible for over 3,500 murders. The prison's remote location, surrounded by icy plains, ensures escape, is a fantasy, the howling wind a constant reminder of its isolation. Inmates arrive blindfolded, bent forward, and led through a maze of corridors to disorient them, preventing them from memorizing the layout. Each cell, secured by 3 metal gates and under 24/7 surveillance, is a concrete tomb where inmates must stand for 16 hours daily, forbidden to sit or lie down until bedtime. The air is stale, the silence broken only by the clank of gates, and then the guards bark orders. Exercise is a 90-minute stint in an outdoor cage, offering no relief from the prison's oppressive routine. The psychological toll is crushing, with inmates facing a lifetime of confinement among psychopaths and murderers. The prison's design motion detectors, steel doors, and constant surveillance ensures compliance. But the enforced standing and isolation break even the strongest wills. Black Dolphin is a place where time stands still, each day a relentless grind of survival in a frozen hell. ADX Florence, nestled in Colorado's Rocky Mountains, is the United States' most secure. Supermax Prison, a fortress designed to hold the nation's most dangerous criminals. Opened in 1994, it houses figures like Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, Richard Reed, the Shoe Bomber, and Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, each confined to a concrete cell for 23 hours a day. The prison's sterile, high-tech design, 1,400 remotely controlled doors, laser beams, pressure pads, and sniper towers makes escape impossible, the air humming with the faint buzz of surveillance systems. Inmates endure near total isolation, their cells equipped with a concrete bed, a small sink, and a toilet, all under constant watch. The 1-hour daily exercise takes place in a steel cage, offering no view of the outside world. The silence is deafening, broken only by the occasional clang of a door or the muffled cries of a breaking mind. The psychological toll is devastating, with many inmates developing severe mental disorders, their isolation of punishment as cruel as any physical torment. ADX Florence's unyielding security and sensory deprivation create a mental prison as oppressive as its physical one. Inmates, aware of their permanent confinement, face a lifetime of hopelessness, their spirits crushed by the weight of an unbreakable system. It is a place where the mind is as much a captive as the body, a testament to America's approach to containing its worst offenders. Diyarbakir Prison in southeastern Turkey is a monument to human cruelty, its history steeped in torture and abuse. Built in the 1960s, it gained infamy during the 1980s, when thousands of reports documented systematic torture, with over 100 deaths attributed to the prison's brutality. The stone walls, stained with decades of suffering, echo with the ghosts of those who endured its horrors, the air thick with the stench of fear and decay. Prisoners faced a litany of tortures, savage beatings, high-pressure water hosing while naked and blindfolded, starvation in isolation cells, and electric shocks. Some had healthy teeth and nails extracted, their limbs crushed, or were subjected to burns. A particularly grotesque method involved a guard's dog, trained to bite prisoners' genitals, adding a sadistic twist to the physical pain. The disco, a psychological torture, saw new inmates thrown into the prison sewers, left for hours amid filth and darkness, their screams unheard. While overt torture has reportedly decreased, allegations of beatings, inhumane conditions, and infestations of cockroaches and disease persist. Diyarbakir's legacy is one of unrelenting cruelty, its reputation as a place of twisted punishment enduring despite efforts to reform. It remains a chilling reminder of how far a system can go in dehumanizing its captives. Antananarivo prison in Madagascar is a nightmare overcrowding and filth, a place where the living conditions are as deadly as any punishment. Built to house 800 inmates, it now holds 4,000, packed into cells so cramped that inmates sleep shoulder to shoulder, on the floor, unable to turn without coordinated effort. The air is suffocating, thick with the stench of sweat, urine, and decay. The prison's walls crawling with cockroaches, rats, lice, and fleas. Bites cover inmates' bodies, leaving festering wounds that spread infection. At 5 p.m., prisoners are locked in cells with shared, overflowing toilets, the temperature soaring past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The lack of space and sanitation breeds diseases like the Black Plague, fueled by the rampant rat population, which has killed countless inmates. Troublemakers are thrown into the hellhole, an isolation, cell covered in human waste, rat carcasses, and trash, a place that lives up to its name. The prison's conditions are so dire that visitors report smelling it before seeing it, a testament to its squalor. Antananarivo's horror lies in its neglect, the inmates abandoned to disease and despair, the lack of basic necessities clean, water, adequate food, medical care makes survival a daily struggle, turning the prison into a living graveyard where hope is as scarce as space. Kechon Prison, known as Camp 14 in North Korea, is the epitome of hell on earth. A political prison camp where 40,000 inmates, including women and children, face a lifetime of hard labor. Unlike other prisons, many here are not criminals, but victims of guilt by association punished for the political crimes of relatives, such as criticizing the regime or attempting escape. The camp's barbed wire fences and guard towers loom over a barren landscape, the air filled with the sounds of pickaxes and the cries of the starving. Conditions are apocalyptic. Inmates, emaciated and desperate, eat frogs, mice, rats, snakes, worms, or grass, risking execution if caught consuming unauthorized food. Starvation is rampant, with bodies swelling from edema, teeth falling out, and bones deteriorating. Diseases like tuberculosis, hepatitis, and pellagra thrive, exacerbated by freezing temperatures that cause frostbite. The camp's brutality extends to punishments, brutal beatings, stress positions, solitary confinement in concrete cells, or instant execution by firing squad. Even suicide carries consequences, with relatives punished for the act. Camp 14's terror lies in its total erasure of humanity. Children born in the camp know only suffering, their lives defined by labor and fear. The regime's secrecy shrouds the camp's horrors, but survivor accounts reveal a place where survival is a miracle, and death by starvation, disease, or execution is a constant shadow. With an estimated 200,000 prisoners across North Korea's camps, Camp 14 stands as a chilling symbol of totalitarian cruelty, a place where hope is not just lost, but forbidden.